Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Harvard Law Forum. I am Pete Davis, the president of the forum. We are the longest-running American law school speaker series. We've hosted Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Jimmy Carter, Jimmy Hoffa, JFK, Vince McMahon, all that, Ebert and Roper. And today we add another person to that motley crew, Isabel Sawhill. Our theme these past 2 years has been to focus on our law school's mission statement, which is to educate leaders who contribute to the advancement of justice and the well-being of society. Isabel Sawhill has spent her life diligently focused on how to advance justice and increase societal well-being. I have two reasons I specifically brought her here today. First, I like to invite folks to the forum who have shown a tireless commitment to thinking deeply and acting vigorously for what they believe is right. For the past half century, Sawhill has been an example of this tenacious commitment. She has served as co-director of the Center on Children and Families, a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, an associate director of the Office of Management and Budget, co-founder of the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy, and senior editor of The Future of Children. See what I mean by working tirelessly and diligently. She has explored economic and social issues, fiscal policy, economic growth, and poverty and inequality. She has written and researched and spoken out for decades on how to improve the lives of disadvantaged children in the United States. And now, as a Brookings Institute senior fellow, she is about to embark on another push to talk about her vision for policy that a divided country could get behind. The second reason I brought Sawhill here today is that she takes seriously the institutions between the individual and the state, what some have called the mediating institutions. Often they're lost in a discourse dominated by solely talk of individual rights and state action. Sawhill takes seriously the reality and the power of these mediating institutions like the family and the workplace. Without further ado, we present new research and new ideas from Isabel Sawhill. Let's hear it for her.
Wow, thank you, Pete. That was the most rousing introduction I think I've just about ever gotten. And so I'm really delighted to be here. I want you all to know that I haven't been here in probably 50 years. I was an undergraduate at Wellesley College, and I once had a date with a guy from Harvard Law School, and he insisted that we come here and play duplicate bridge. Now, my bridge game was not exactly up to snuff, and furthermore, most of the other people in the duplicate game were law school professors, and they were all old and crusty, and in those days they were all male, of course. And so I was terrified, and of course eager to impress my date. Well, somehow or other I survived, but anyway, it's nice to be back here again in a slightly different context, and so I thank you very much for inviting me. So I have written this book. It's not yet published, but it's kind of on its way. And I start out with, to quote from the little red book that Pete just gave me, one of the felt necessities of our times, just to show you I read fast. This is a quote, of course, from Oliver Wendell Holmes. So where we start is with the problem, and the problem is, in my view, a lack of inclusive economic growth in the United States. And what that means is that we have had less economic growth than we did in the past, and whatever growth we've had has been much more unequally distributed, with most of the gains going to people at the top. I think you all know that story. Raj Chetty and his colleagues have done a lot of work, for example, on the intergenerational mobility rates of people in the younger generation, people sort of your age versus people my age. And in my generation, your chances of being better off than your parents economically was about 90%. Now it's dropped to about 50%, and it's been on this downward trajectory now for quite a long time. So that naturally causes people to say, well, what we need to do is boost economic growth and make sure it's more evenly distributed. And I think there's nothing wrong with that view and that approach. It's very common right now, but I want to suggest that it's probably not our best approach to the problem. Here's why in a nutshell. First of all, both of these things, more growth, a more equal distribution, are very hard to achieve. More growth is very hard to achieve because we don't know how to do it. I'm an economist. I hang out with all the best macroeconomists and other kinds of economists at Brookings, and they can talk until the cows come home about economic growth and what drives it, capital, labor, productivity, and nobody really knows how to boost growth, especially productivity growth. As Bob Solow says, we see the computer revolution everywhere except in the productivity statistics. So growth may pick up. Right now it's very strong because the labor market is so tight, but we don't really know how to control it. Distribution, that is easy technically. I mean, you can raise taxes on the rich and give money to the middle class and the poor. That's not difficult from a technical perspective or a policy perspective, but it's very hard politically. And in fact, I think it's so hard that in my book, I talk about it a lot. I have lots of chapters on what's been happening to inequality and what we might do about it. But in the end, I come back to another theme and another approach, which is to focus on work, to focus on jobs and wages. And some paid time off for other purposes. I mean, we can't work all the time. I have a whole chapter on reforming Social Security to provide more paid leave for lifelong learning and for family care, but I'm not going to get into that today because I don't have time. Now, why do I think work is so important? First of all, it's what the forgotten Americans, the sort of bottom half of our population, wants. It's what they talk about all the time. I'll say more about that in a minute. Second, it's a politically unifying theme. Who can be against giving people jobs and better wages? Even Republicans and stark conservatives talk about that. Their way of getting there may be a little bit indirect, trickle down, et cetera, but they at least think it's the right goal. Third, work provides more than just an income. It provides dignity, self-respect, a sense of identity, connection to other people. So I think it's very important for all those reasons. Now, I have a very specific, agenda of things that we could do, and I'm going to talk about some of my ideas in more detail in a moment. But before I get to those ideas and the policy agenda here, I really want to talk about the political environment, because if we can't get something done, it's not going to be very useful. And here, I think the key is to start with values. Not everybody outside of rooms like this one is interested in, the details of public policy. But they do have values, and I think we need to focus on a set of very broadly shared values. And to me, the most important are family, education, and work, but especially work. So this book is really more about work. I wrote another book a few years ago on the family. And my next book will probably have to be about education if I don't die first, but we'll see. Now, after we talk about values, then I think we also need to talk about institutions. And this is where what Pete said about mediating institutions comes in. I think that there's no confidence right now in government, especially the federal government. When I introduce myself or meet new people nowadays and they say, "Where are you from?" I say, "I'm from the swamp." And I'm proud of being from the swamp, and some of my best friends are alligators. And that's, of course, Washington, D.C. But I think we therefore need to find ways of delivering new help to people, not necessarily through the federal government. I mean, it's obviously going to have some role to play, but wherever possible through lower levels of government. The faith and confidence in state and local governments is much higher than in the federal government. Community colleges, not Harvard, businesses, NGOs, these are the kinds of institutions that would be the best delivery vehicles in my view. Okay, let's talk about the so-called forgotten Americans. This pie chart is very simple. It includes everybody in the working age population in the United States. And the slices on the right there are college educated. Now, that means having a BA degree, at least. I'm not worried about them, those speckled slices. I'm worried about the people on the other side, which is about 65% of the population, by the way. And so the blue slice, which is the biggest slice, is white, non-college educated, working age individuals. The red is African Americans, and the yellow is Hispanics and a few other minority groups. So a couple of takeaways from this. First of all, the blue slice voted overwhelmingly for Mr. Trump, and I'll come back to that. They are a large chunk of the population. They're the single largest chunk in that whole pie. They also, from a moral perspective, shouldn't be ignored. They have real grievances, as we can talk about more. But politically, they can't be ignored either, because they can really influence elections, as we've seen, especially in 2016. And that has consequences for everyone, including all of the other slices there, not just them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this group, the so-called white working class. It's gotten a lot of attention, but I don't want you to think the book is just about them. The book is about all of the forgotten Americans, including the minority groups as well. Okay, a little bit about the 2016 election. It was very close. You all know that. You know, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. So I call that a black swan election, you know, an event that occurred with a very low probability but very big consequences. 2/3 of this white working class voted for Trump. They really are what put him in office. And the reasons that have been debated endlessly by political scientists now were both economics and culture. This is my fun chart. This is the president, as usual, exaggerating just a little bit. And this is the black swan doing a little bit of fact-checking on what he's saying. So that's just for fun. Now, this story about the white working class is not just an economic story, although it is an economic story. That this group is suffering from a loss of jobs, a loss of wages, especially the men. The women are doing a little bit better. And they are arguably suffering from what I call status anxiety. Now, you know the drill here. They don't like immigrants, even though they live in areas where, in fact, there are very, very few immigrants. They think trade is destroying their jobs. And even though most economists, as you know again, think that restrictions like the kind we're seeing now, tariffs on aluminum, on steel, they think that will help them. They're big fans, obviously, of the Second Amendment. They don't like all the focus on the rights of women, minorities, LGBTQ community, etc. And they believe in personal responsibility. They don't want handouts. They want jobs. And it would be easy after all of that to call them, as Hillary Clinton did, a bunch of deplorables, but I think that might be a mistake. So unless political leaders can speak to this group, or at least to a much larger fraction of them than now, those leaders will be leaving out a very big chunk of the electorate, and that will have implications for all of us. I did a lot of reading about all of this when I was doing the research on my book. These are the two best-known books. I think everybody knows about J.D. Vance's book by now. He's gotten a lot of attention. The book by Arlie Hochschild, who's a professor at Berkeley, is, I think, even better and more interesting. These are all direct quotes from those two books. I can recommend both of them to you. Now, despite these cultural anxieties, what this group really still wants, look at the quote up there, "We can't get jobs," that's their biggest concern. That comes out in this literature time and time again. They really just think the jobs have disappeared. It's, the story here, manufacturing, deindustrialization, whole communities that used to have a factory that provided everyone with a good job and a decent wage have disappeared. Now Trump is exploiting and pandering to this group. At the same time, I think it's clear he's not really addressing their actual needs. I don't think, in fact, it's too strong to say that he's embraced an oligarchic agenda dressed in populist clothes. What we need instead is an agenda that directly addresses the economic grievances of this group and all the other forgotten Americans, all the, African American and Latino and others as well. Now, that's easier said than done, and this is where we get back to my theme that we're facing some political and cultural constraints right now that we have to figure out how to deal with. And one of the biggest constraints here is the lack of confidence in government. These are the Pew data on what's happened to the proportion of the American public that thinks that government does the right thing at least most of the time. And as you can see, it's plummeted with a little bit of a peak back at the time of 9/11. Now, there are a few exceptions here to this lack of confidence in government. There's still a lot of popularity for Social Security, Medicare, to some extent education, minimum wage, a few other things. But in general, people don't like government. This little quote in yellow here I love. This is from a 2010 town hall meeting where a guy gets up, you probably all know this story, and says to a member of Congress at the town hall where they're discussing the Affordable Care Act, and he's speaking about it, and this guy says, "I don't want the government taking over my Medicare." And we all laugh and say, how could he have been so unsophisticated? But it's also telling you something. So what are the political implications of all of this? I think that, first of all, in the current political environment, there's just this one issue that transcends our cultural and our political divide, and that is jobs. And it's going to be hard to find compromises on things like gay rights, abortion, gun control, immigration. I understand those are all huge issues in many people's minds, whether you're for or against. But the point is those issues are dividing us apart, are driving us apart. And I'm not optimistic that by focusing on them, we're going to make a lot of progress. You can, of course, disagree with that. But I think there's a huge space right now in the middle of the electorate the moderate middle, which most of the public, unlike their elected leaders, the public at large is not highly conservative or highly liberal. They're somewhere in between. And so there's a place, a big space for one of the or the other of the two parties to move into that middle space. Personally, I don't see any indications that Republicans are about to move there. Trump could have used his election to move to the middle, but he didn't, or to move the Republican Party to the middle, but he didn't. And Democrats are now having a big debate between the sort of left-wing side of the party and the more moderate side of the party, and we'll see how that all comes out. What you're going to find about my agenda, which I'm about to get to, is that it articulates some pretty conservative values and then attaches to those conservative values some pretty progressive policies. And this is my attempt to deal with the political constraints that are out there, but get something done for the forgotten Americans. Okay, so let me talk first about values. These are the three mainstream values that I talk about a lot in the book. And we've done a lot of work over the years at Brookings. My colleague Ron Haskins and I, we wrote a book some years ago called Creating an Opportunity Society. We talked about these values a lot, and we did some research on what happens if you do just three things. The three things are get an education, at least a high school education, ideally a little more nowadays. Secondly, work full-time. And thirdly, either marry or get a stable partner before you have children and be, both of you committed to parenthood. If people did all of those three things, our data suggests that only about 2% would fall into poverty and over 70% would make it into the middle class or higher. And we can go into that if you're interested, but that's just to give you a little flavor for this. We call this the success sequence, doing these three things in that order: first education, then work, then family. And it's been very resonant on both sides of the aisle and in the media. Which is one reason I'm optimistic that it might still be so in the future. Now, going to the focus on jobs and wages, I have about a 5-point agenda in my book. Actually, my book is just full of policy ideas, to tell you the truth. It has too much packed into it. But I'm going to talk about three today because I only have limited time. First of all, a new GI Bill for American workers and reskilling the workforce. Secondly, a worker tax credit for the bottom half. And third, a bigger role for a new and bigger role for the private sector in training and sharing profits with workers. The last two items I put in red because I'm not going to have time to talk about them, but we can go to them if you have questions later. Okay, first item on the agenda is reskilling the workforce. And I think this is pretty straightforward. We know that we have a system right now of unemployment insurance that gives you benefits if you lose your job. But what we need instead in this new economy with all the transitions that are occurring is reemployment insurance instead of unemployment insurance. So you would get benefits to retrain, to relocate, to get better counseling and more information about where the jobs are. Now, we have some programs like that now, but they're small, they're terribly underfunded, they're not all that effective. And I think what we need instead is, first of all, a lot more resources for this task, and secondly, and most importantly, job training that's linked to the jobs that actually exist. And so there needs to be partnerships, for example, between community colleges and employers. I went down to Louisville, Kentucky, met with a group down there where they have a partnership between the local community colleges and the employers in the area, and they are doing a fabulous job of training people who come in at minimum wage and by the end of a couple of years are making $50,000 a year. And it's a very impressive program. It's an example of what I'm talking about. We also need more work-based learning, such as apprenticeships. And the good news here is there is increasing bipartisan interest in what we used to call vocational education and we now call career and technical education. Now, as part of this, by the way, I think you all know the story here about why more of this is needed. I mean, we've got a dynamic economy, we have AI, we have robots, we have machine learning, we have big data, we have autonomous vehicles, we have all the things that are coming that should make us richer and better off, but are going to displace people in the short run. I think there's going to be plenty of jobs there in the long run. There are going to be new jobs to replace the old jobs, but the transitions are going to be difficult for individuals and for communities. As part of this sort of reskilling agenda, another thing I want to do is argue for national service. And I'm talking here about everybody coming out of high school and being expected to do a year of service for the country. Could be military, but more likely to be civilian. And right now we have a small program. It's called AmeriCorps. When I was in the Clinton administration, this was President Clinton's favorite program. Every time I fell down on the job and didn't advocate hard enough for this, I'd get a call from somebody in the White House saying, what are you doing about national service? So we got the program up and running. Of course, it's a direct descendant of the Peace Corps and other things created under President Kennedy. But it's very small. It's, again, underfunded. And I think that what I want to do is, first of all, expand it. Secondly, add a family exchange program. What do I mean by a family exchange program? It's a direct analogy with a foreign exchange program. So we bring foreign students to America, right, and we let them live with an American family, and it builds friendships and ties between the foreign students and the families in America. Well, we need to do that domestically now. We need families across America to open their homes to a person, a young person, who is going to do some national service in a community far from their own home. They wouldn't have to go far from their own home, but many should and will want to. And they will live with a family, and they will get to know each other, and we will create new friendships and new ties across regions, across communities, across states in the U.S. At least that's my vision of it. Now, right now, the way AmeriCorps works is you do a year of national service. By the way, it's a decentralized program. Yes, there is a federal component of it, but the money goes out to the states. The states then give money to communities and to NGOs. This funds the Red Cross, it funds Teach for America, it funds Youth Build, it funds environmental groups, and so forth and so on. And by the way, the demand on the part of the NGO community for volunteers is very great. They love this. And the number of people right now who are volunteering, even without a big push on it, is more than can be placed. So it's been pretty successful, although it's a somewhat untold story. It also passes a benefit cost test. I worried about that being an economist. The reason it, granted that this is difficult research to do, but the argument is it passes a benefit cost test because the young people are providing services that are valuable at a price that is cheap. And furthermore, they're getting some life skills and some experiences that are valuable. And between all of that, it more than pays for itself. The young people get a stipend while they're in the program, and then they get the equivalent of a Pell Grant to go to college. So there are educational benefits for the youth that are tied to this. I'm queasy about making it mandatory. I would just try to make it a new sort of expectation and change norms and have incentives like companies giving, which they do now, companies give preference to National Service Corps members, and so do colleges. So, you know, Harvard Law School should give credit if you've gone through a program like this. And this is what Roger Cohen from the New York Times says about it, and I kind of think he's right. By the way, one of the things we know has happened is, in addition to these cultural divides, we have less geographic mobility than we used to, especially amongst younger Americans. It used to be that you grew up somewhere and then you moved away from your family home. Now we got a lot of people in their 20s, even their 30s, living at home or at least staying in their local community, not moving, and that's one reason I think why these divides are growing. So this would encourage geographic mobility as well. Okay, now I want to get to rewarding work. Now this is my most expensive and boldest idea, and it's a worker tax credit that would boost wages or take-home pay for everyone in the bottom half of the earnings distribution. It's similar to the earned income tax credit. How many of you are familiar with the earned income tax credit? Most of you, okay. Well, the earned income tax credit, just quickly, for those of you who are not, is a quite generous, it's our biggest anti-poverty program right now, first of all. Secondly, it mainly serves single moms and their kids. You pretty much have to have children to get any decent benefits. There's some tiny benefits for people without children, but they don't amount to a hill of beans. And it's conditional on work. So the worker tax credit, I'd be happy if we just expanded the EITC, but I think a worker tax credit is better. Why do I think it's better? First of all, it's much simpler. You just get it because you're a worker and because you have earnings below about $40,000 a year. You automatically get it. It comes in your paycheck. It offsets your payroll taxes. It effectively eliminates payroll taxes for about the bottom half of all earners. And so it's the other thing about the EITC and about a worker tax credit, it's refundable. In other words, if you don't have any taxes that you owe already, you get it in your paycheck. So there's some administrative issues here, but put them aside for the moment. There are lots of ways to structure it. I suggest a 15% phase-in, 15% of your earnings, so think of it as a 15% boost in your after-tax pay. And then it would be capped. It could be capped at $1,500 or $2,000, something like that. And then it would start to phase out somewhere around $40,000. Now, I have a research assistant right now who's actually about to enter a PhD program here at Harvard, and she's done zillions of charts and tables in Excel that show what it costs under all these different designs, and it is expensive. It would cost about as much as the tax cut, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the recent tax bill that went through Congress, to give you an idea, which is, you know, $1.5 trillion over 10 years, about $150 billion per year. So that's just ballpark. I mean, you know, you can obviously ratchet it up or down. How to pay for it? Well, I'm going to have some ideas at the end of this talk about lots of pay-fors, but my favorite way to pay for it, and I've written a short paper on this, is by bringing back the estate tax, and maybe even changing it into an inheritance tax. But, you know, forgetting about whether it's an estate tax or an inheritance tax, they do differ somewhat, as I'm sure you know. The estate tax is you know, the exemption is being lifted to 11 million, 22 per couple, as a result of the recent bill, and Republicans then want to phase it out entirely. So I looked back at what the estate tax was in the 1970s, and it turns out that, the exemption level was much lower back then, about $500,000 per couple, about, 300,000 per individual. And the top marginal rate was very high. It was 77%. But when did the 77% kick in? Not until you had an estate worth more than $60 million in today's dollars. So that doesn't sound so bad to me. And I never thought the estate tax was a big revenue raiser until I started looking at this, and it can be a big revenue raiser. I could pay for my whole worker tax credit for the bottom half by simply bringing back the kind of estate tax that we lived happily with in the 1970s. Why do I like the estate tax so much? I think inheritances are windfalls. The data show that most of the people who get inheritances from their parents typically are already very wealthy by the time they get them. I mean, you can do a distributional analysis here, and it's the rich giving to the rich, or the not quite as rich yet, but getting there fast. And so it's a windfall. It's what I call welfare for the rich. It's totally unearned. It doesn't fit with the value of work. You don't have to do anything if you have rich parents and they die and you inherit a lot of money. So it's totally inconsistent with the value of work that we attach a lot to, I think, in this country. And it's also inconsistent with our notion that we are a classless society and that we don't want a big accumulation of wealth at the top. And the baby boomer generation has a huge amount of wealth, much more than any prior generation. And that wealth is about to get transferred to their children. So really in favor of bringing that back. Oh, yes, in addition to the worker tax credit, I'm in favor of more assistance for childcare and a higher minimum wage. But, those are standard policy ideas, and I won't go into them further right now. But if we did all three, that would really help this forgotten American group a lot. Okay, next idea is, and this is the third and last. How are we doing on time?
You got about 15 minutes.
A bigger role for the private sector, a new and bigger role for the private sector. And my thinking here is that jobs are created in the private sector, obviously. That's where most people earn their income. If we wanted to do a major redistribution outside of the private sector, it would cost a fortune and I think would be politically impossible. So I think we need to think about redistributing market incomes, and the way to do that is to change the way that private sector operates and bring back what I call inclusive capitalism. I'll get to that in a moment, but the first thing we need to do before we get there, and as part of getting there, is to repeal and replace the 2017 tax law. And I think that's going to happen. It happened with the Reagan tax cuts. Some previous tax cuts. It's going to happen again because there are all kinds, as I'm sure you know, problems in the bill as it was enacted. And obviously, if Democrats regain any political power at all, this will be at the top of their list. So I think it is likely to be amended. Now, just before we leave that, I'll show you a couple of things. As you know, the major argument for the 17 tax cuts, which mostly went to corporations and non-incorporated businesses, pass-through businesses, and to wealthy individuals. The argument was this would help to create jobs and raise wages. And this is the standard supply-side theory. If we make it possible, businesses will do a lot more. They will be incentivized to invest more. That will create jobs that will raise wages. This is a chart from my colleague Bill Gale that he likes to show a lot, and I kind of like it too. It just shows you what the correlation is between revenue as a proportion of GDP and real GDP growth per capita. Now, we could get into a lot more detail on this, which I don't have time for, but keep in mind we reduced taxes under Reagan, we reduced taxes under Bush, now we've reduced taxes once again under Trump, and we still haven't seen a big surge of economic growth. In fact, we had more growth, far more growth during the Clinton administration than we've had during any of the three I just mentioned. And that doesn't prove anything by itself, but it sure raises questions. And the poster child for the failure of supply-side economics is probably the state of Kansas, where you had a very conservative governor who reduced taxes enormously, and it created such a big hole in their budget that the Republican legislature in Kansas eventually had to raise taxes over the governor's veto. This is just a standard chart from the Tax Policy Center on the distribution of this latest tax cut. The yellow bars are the ones to focus on because those are the only ones that are still going to be available at the end of 2027 unless Congress re-ups the law, which they will try to do. But right now, everybody gets some tax cut. 80% of the population gets some tax cut, but it is skewed towards the top, and it's especially skewed to the top in the longer run. Here is now why I think we really need to focus on, or some of the reasons why we need to focus on the private sector. And I need to go a little faster here maybe. Wages have not kept up with productivity since about the 1970s. So, workers are not getting their share of what they're producing. That's Exhibit 1. Exhibit 2 is CEO compensation is out of control. Back in the 1970s, the ratio of CEO compensation to average worker compensation was about 30-1. Now it's closer to 300-1. Exhibit 3, the investments by the private sector in training workers have been going down. Now, some of that is related to the fact that people change jobs. There's a lot of mobility in the labor market, and so there's a market failure here. But I'd like to see us correct that, maybe through a training tax credit similar to the R&D tax credit. If you believe, as I do, that work-based learning, OJT if you will, is the best form of training, the most valuable, then we need to do something like that. Moving to a more inclusive form of capitalism, what some people call stakeholder capitalism, shouldn't be that hard. We had it back in the 50s and 60s. I can remember it. And there are still companies that practice it now. You all know about Ben & Jerry's and Patagonia and Southwest Airlines and a number of others that I talk about in my book. And they are doing it the right way. But what an awful lot of corporate America is doing these days is really focusing very sharply on rate of return to shareholders, short-term profits, quarterly earnings. People are obsessed with quarterly earnings. And this is not helping either our long-term growth rate or the ability of everyone to benefit from it. So what I'd like to see us do is adopt a more inclusive form of capitalism with tax incentives that would be built into the Tax Cut and Jobs Act when we repeal and replace it. Now, here you are all lawyers or getting to be lawyers, and there is a debate in the legal community, as I understand it, about whether it is the duty of the directors of a private corporation to make sure that the first priority is rewarding shareholders. The debate seems to be that that's become the norm, and there have been some legal cases about it, but that it is not actually technically the law. So I'm not a lawyer. You may want to come back and question me on that or tell me what you know about that, because I won't have all the answers. But I've been impressed with the number of people I've read who say it is legal. More importantly, it works. By that I mean, I thought when I first got into this research, this can't be true. You can't do well and do good at the same time. There's a trade-off. Well, it turns out that the trade-off is really hard to find. I looked as hard as I could to see, well, do the companies that treat their workers well, that focus on the long term instead of the short term, that have a stakeholder model instead of a shareholder model, do they do worse in terms of the bottom line, revenue growth, profitability, et cetera? And the answer is overwhelmingly, from the bulk of the research, no. Now, I even worried about, which way does the causation go? So I looked at a randomized controlled trial on this, which I could tell you about, but want to get beyond that. So I think it's possible to bring back this more inclusive form of capitalism. Here is a chart from a McKinsey study that I really, again, recommend to you. The McKinsey study compared companies with a long-term focus, value-based companies versus those who focus more on the short term. And they found that the companies that were focused on the long term had higher profitability, more revenue growth, and more job growth. This just happens to be their chart on job growth. So if we're talking about creating jobs and we're talking about boosting wages, we shouldn't rely just on government. We should try to bring back this much more inclusive form of capitalism and provide some incentives for that purpose. Finally, I have a bunch of financing options. My favorite is a value-added tax. It's a kind of national sales tax, as you know. Now, liberals don't like value-added taxes because they're regressive, and conservatives don't like them because they're a revenue machine. And Larry Summers once said, well, we will get a value-added tax when liberals understand they are a revenue machine and conservatives understand that they are regressive. And I think he's right. Now, they don't have to be regressive, by the way. You can exclude essentials. And furthermore, as Michael Graetz at Yale Law School has argued very well, I think, you can eliminate income taxes on the entire bottom half of the population if you enact a VAT. He says, imagine April 15th would just be another spring day. Most of the population wouldn't have to worry about it, and imagine how politically popular that would be. So let me conclude here. This is just a big summary at the end. I think that most people, we do need to go back to values and the fact that most people want to support their families and they want some help with that, but they don't want handouts. I think government does have a role to play, but so does the private sector and all these other institutions that we've talked about. I think that we can do all of this if we amend the recent tax law, if we introduce a VAT, similar to what, by the way, every other rich country has. In the European Union, you have to have a VAT. It's their biggest source of revenue, and they are able to fund a much more generous social welfare set of programs as a result. So I think that's it in a nutshell, so happy to open it up now.
Let's hear it for Isabel Sawhill.
Oh, the book.
The book. And when is that coming out?
Not till September.
Okay, great. I'm sure there's questions, critiques, pushback, ideas. Any questions for me?
Yeah, by the way, this is the first time I've given a talk on this topic, so I'm really eager for feedback. What did you like, not understand, disagree with, etc.?
Let's start with Dave.
Yeah.
So I think I saw on your list of 5 proposals, one of the ones you didn't get to was the jobs-based safety net.
Uh-huh.
So I am from I work with a group called the Modern Money Network. One of the things that we've been interested in for a long time and that a lot of research has been working on for decades now, it seems to be starting to finally be entering the mainstream discussion, is a jobs guarantee program. So I guess I'm just curious, is that where you're going with your jobs-based safety net? And also based on everything you had leading up to it, I would have thought that would have been higher up in your priority list. So why is
Yeah. Perfect question. I do address that question very frontally in the book. There are proposals out there, including from the Center for American Progress, for example, and others, to have a guaranteed jobs program. I'm not quite there. Here's, people have images of the WPA and what we did during the New Deal when, of course, we had like 25% of the population unemployed. My first line of defense on jobs is monetary and fiscal policy. And I get frustrated that people don't understand that that has to be our first line of defense, and it really is powerful. Look at where we are right now with an unemployment rate of 4.1%, headed to 3.5%, and the Fed beginning to tighten, but employers complaining that they can't find workers, marginal workers getting jobs that they couldn't get before, wages beginning to tick up, companies, especially tech companies, suddenly offering all kinds of benefits, like paid leave, for example, that they didn't benefit before. So I want that to be really the focus here. And that doesn't mean there aren't going to be, that we're going to be able to eliminate the business cycle and we aren't going to have some periods when there aren't enough jobs. It also doesn't mean that structural unemployment isn't a problem. So during the periods of cyclical downturn, I'm in favor of an investment bank, like an infrastructure investment bank, in which you would have some money socked away and it would be independent. It would be like the Federal Reserve. So it would be outside of the direct control of Congress, so that projects could be chosen by a professional staff on the merits, and priorities could be set on infrastructure projects, and that's a job creator, obviously. And then my job-based safety net is for people like ex-felons who are coming out of prison and no employer wants to touch them. And there are some marginal groups like that who just need a chance to connect to the labor market, and I'm in favor of that. I am not in favor of a massive job creation program for everyone. It's expensive, it's very bureaucratic, and furthermore, there's this idealistic vision that we have in our heads, in my view, that all we need to do, that there are just tons of work that needs to be done. We need to clean up parks and fix schools and take care of the elderly and kids and, all that, and the environment and all that. And I'm in favor of that through national service. But I think that the problem with saying people who can't find a job in the private sector are going to be great at taking care of your children or your elderly parents, or are going to be great at creating, a new school building or whatever, is just not very realistic. The people who can't get jobs in the private sector during normal times are people who probably have various kinds of problems. And so I think this is not going to work. That's my view.
We're unfortunately out of time, but you'll be sticking around outside
Yep,
for a couple
yep,
of minutes.
yep.
And please come up and bring other thoughts. Let's hear it one more time. To Isabel.